Hello and welcome to this ICMI20 interview of Erin Pizzey with myself, William Collins, and Elizabeth Hobson, leader of J4MB. Now, Erin Pizzey will be familiar to most of you, though we hope to explore some of the less familiar aspects of her work and life in this interview. Famously, Erin opened the first refuge for battered women in Chiswick in 1971 by accident, as she says. Yeah. Erin had already had an early brush with the Marxist feminists who were attempting to gain a foothold in the UK at that time. But previous experience with communism in China alerted Erin to its dangers, and she never had any truck with it. The success of the Chiswick house and the associated publicity attracted the growing feminist movement and attracted specifically their ire, not least because they wanted the cash. So 1974 saw the formation of Women's Aid in the UK, a federation which brought together under its umbrella the 40 independent refuge services which existed by then.
That was a lie.
Is that a lie on the website? Yeah, I must admit, when I saw 40, I thought in 4 years. No, I don't think.
No. I think there's only one actually, and I do want to explain to you something because it happened very specifically. Because I was extremely politically naive, and none of us in the refuge had any real political experience. My political experience wasn't political with communism. They captured my father and my mother and my brother in Tin Sin in '49, and they were under house arrest. And I didn't see them. We didn't know whether they were alive or dead, actually, for 3 years. So when they came out, it was horrific, the information that came out of that. My father was a diplomat, and his job, most of his life, was to fight its encroaching communism. So when we, very unwisely, mothers and I used to sit at 10 o'clock in the morning all together and decide what we were going to do for the day. And we were talking about how we could actually encourage other people to open refuges, because we had stacked the ceiling. And not only that, because women were coming in from other boroughs, we were told that they would never, the local borough, Hounslow, would never rehouse any of the mothers from other boroughs. It wasn't their business. So, well, obviously, and we discussed the idea that no, we didn't want to become an organization like so many of the charities where all the money went to growing the charity and salaries. But what we do is to try and suggest federations, loose federations where each area would have their own refuge, and then we could swap families when it was too dangerous to keep your mother and kids in the area that you were in. So we called a tiny conference. We had a church hall, which we used to use for our children's playgroup. And so we made the date, and it was in 1974. And we went trundling along quite happily, expecting, we knew that Dublin Women's Aid were coming in because we'd gone over there to help them open. And men were involved in the opening and involved in all the organizing, as they were in our refuge. And then suddenly through the door came all these small organizations. And to our horror, because we were the national charity at that point, they voted themselves into the National Federation of Women's Aid. And we sat there like lemons with our mouths open because we'd never even been involved in all this voting kind of stuff. And we looked at each other desperately. And we said, we'll abstain. And actually, that whole story is in a book called Sweet Freedom, which was written by Anna Coote and Beatrix Campbell, who are avowed gender feminists. If we have time, I can read you their excerpt where they describe what they saw happened.
Right. So that's very useful, Erin, because that I must admit, when I read that on the website, I thought, that 40 in that many years, that doesn't sound right. It sounds like, if I'm understanding you correctly, they effectively set up a load of basically puppet or shadow companies to act as way in which they could vote you out. Is that the basic?
Right. And what we hadn't realized is they'd all been meeting to arrange all this, unbeknown to us. And I knew that there was one possible refuge actually open, and that was Acton Women's Aid, which was the next borough to ours. But as far as I was aware, and I would have been aware, because there was a huge amount of publicity, there were virtually no other refuges open. What there were feminist groups who gathered together by this point realizing that they needed a just cause, a sympathetic cause, because they were too radical, and most women had actually left. Because in those days, you paid your £3.10, which is a lot of money for a housewife in those days, to join. And then you were incorporated into this Marxist nonsense. So we knew that there were, and anyway, but the groups came down and they voted, as you said, they voted us out. And what they did is they went straight to the Department of Health and Social Security. We had a tiny grant of $3,000 a year. That was taken away from us. The department were delighted because we were massively overcrowded. And also we wouldn't turn anybody away, and we wouldn't obey all the rules and the laws. And we just fought openly and were picketing and making a terrible nuisance of ourselves. So they were very glad to get this.
So that's how you lost control, essentially, of the National Federation in 1974.
Well, it wasn't even that. We lost the narrative because we have been saying, we all, I was there every single day except for weekends. And so I knew everybody very well. And we were doing questionnaires. And you could see that, as I always said, 62 of the mothers out of the first 100 were as violent as the men they left. But that made them even more precious because we needed to mother them so they could mother their children.
Yeah. Moving on the story to 81, 82, because many people have asked us this question. I believe what happened was you were virtually driven out of the country by threats. So is that true? And is there any truth in the story that there's a dog killed? That was something to do with it?
Later in America. No, what happened is, yes, it was a bit, well, you have to remember that at that time, it was a very volatile time in the history of England. A lot of radical movements, the Anglo Brigade were bombing, if you remember, all that kind of thing happening. And what happened is, anywhere I went, I'd get huge pickets following me, and I'd get threats on the phone, and I sort of just accepted that as part of what the fight I was in.
Were you still in charge of the Chiswick house at this point?
Oh yes, and then what happened is that I was nervous of obviously what was happening, and then my daughter telephoned me I was in the refuge and said, a package has come. It's got no stamps on it or anything. What should I do? And I said, well, take it out in the garden and put it right at the end of the garden, and I'll ring the police, because I was nervous. So I rang the police, and by the time I got back there, the bomb squad followed me in, and there were these huge men all covered in all sorts of the protective gear, and they went out, and actually, obviously it wasn't a bomb, but they came in and they said, from now on, all your post has to come to us first, because, we're worried. So at that point, I just thought to myself, and I was looking at my two little grandchildren, and a look of fear on their face when they saw those huge men, the big blue lights outside. I can't live like this. And that's when I decided, anyway, I knew I was going to be pushed out anyway.
So, yeah, this was part of the attempt to, well, not the attempt, but the successful attempt to oust you from the Chiswick house, presumably.
Well, it was Lord Goodman. He was an evil man. He was a really evil man, and I hated him from the moment I met him. But he was one of the most powerful men in that time in England, and he was an old friend of the great and the good, and one of them, David Astor, was actually my chair, and I knew once he introduced me to Lord Goodman that it wouldn't last very long, because he'd get me out. And that's what he did. It was very clever maneuvering, but at the end of the day, I don't want to dwell on that too much, because in a strange way, I also knew that the way I was running Chiswick, and the fact that we would never turn anybody away, we were the biggest. It was anarchy as far as the government was concerned, because we were the biggest squatting country in agency in the country. We owned sort of roads that we'd squatted. We owned the Farm Court Hotel that had 40 private suites. So we were a huge threat.
Right. So I know that Lord Goodman was somehow associated with Lord Astor, and Lord Astor was one of your chief backers.
It wasn't
I thought Goodman was sort of involved in that, but
very much.
I've never been able to work out to what extent. I know he's a very dodgy character, but I was never able to figure out the extent to which he was helping Lord Astor, or the extent to which he was actually hindering you. And what's the connect? I've sort of assumed that it was the feminist movement that ousted you from Chiswick.
They didn't need to,
So how is the feminist movement involved with Lord Goodman? That's the connection.
Once we walked out of that little tiny meeting, they got what they wanted. They got the money. That they knew that they no longer had to even bother with us. And we sat down back at the refuge, and we talked about it. And I said, we could go on and try and fight them politically. That none of us have any experience, or we can just get on with what we know needs to happen, which is to actually keep taking in mothers, which we did for 10 years, all the years I was there. But it was David Astor, wasn't it Lord Astor? That was another one. David Astor was a multi-millionaire, and what happened is that this tall, shambling figure walked into Chiswick and looked at me. I had no idea who he was. And then Jojo, who was our housekeeper, she came in and she whispered to me, "That's David Astor. He owns the Observer." And I looked at him and he said to me, "What can I do for you?" And I said, "What you can do is next time the television comes to talk to me about the refuge," because at that point they were trying to jail me for overcrowding. I'd been served with warrants. I said, "You just tell them that you're going to go to jail instead of me," which is what he did. And then there was a summons that I had to go and see Lord Goodman. And David took me there, and we went to his very posh flat opposite the BBC. And he was looking at me, and he just said, "I will come and help you." And at that point, I was too naive to realize that isn't what he was saying. He was saying, "I will extract David out of this mess."
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, there's all sorts of stories I think you could probably tell us about Lord Goodman, but perhaps we better not record those unless you want to.
He's dead.
Sorry?
He's dead. So, and he essentially what happened is I couldn't understand how, with this rather ramshackle private little law firm, that he could live the way he did, because he had this magnificent flat and a housekeeper and a Bentley and a chauffeur, and he endlessly entertained. Well, the truth was he was in charge of the Portland Trust for one of the young trustees, young inheritors, and he'd stolen in those days over $1 million. He milked it for himself, and it wasn't found out until he was dying. He lost a leg gangrene because he had diabetes, so they didn't prosecute him, and nobody ever really knew what happened to the money, except a lot of it went to members of the Labour Party. He was Harold Wilson's right hand. He boasts that Harold never made a decision without Lord Goodman.
Good heavens.
Wow. I wonder if...
just before I hand over to Elizabeth, for those people who want to know more about it, Erin's book, This Way to the Revolution, a memoir, is available at a very reasonable price from Amazon. And you can read more about that story in that book. Elizabeth.
Yeah, I'm wondering, because you spoke earlier about losing control of the narrative to these Marxist feminist organizations. And obviously, their narrative is at odds with your findings that, the women were equally violent to the men. They left a lot of them. And because they ignore that, I'm wondering how useful are they in terms of helping women, Women's Aid and Refuge? How much do they help?
Well, what they do is they very carefully screen. So women who are alcoholic or drug addicts or have problems or histories of violence, in other words, police histories, they won't get in. And they're the people that most need the refuges. And if they do get in, right, they are even minimally violent. They're evicted.
Oh.
Yeah.
So they go specifically for the battered wives,
well,
not prone to violence.
There were two major problems. The one that most involved me was women who were violent themselves, created in violent relationships, and either remained in those violent relationships or made other violent relationships. And I realized, because I came from that sort of a family, so my mother was the really violent one. And I realized that what those women needed was alternative strategies for survival, because the only survival strategies they knew, understandably, were violence.
Mm.
And but the other side of the coin was women and men who by accident get involved with a violent person. They need help and they need refuge and they need legal advice, but they don't need long-term therapeutic treatment because they've come from warm, loving homes and they can take care of their children. And the other thing that's so upsetting is refugees won't take boys, sometimes over the age of 9, but over the age of 12. And these boys are still children.
Yeah. And
when you try and reason, they'll simply say, no, they're a danger to the girls. Well, I took any mother bringing in her children, and some of them will be 17 or 18 years old. They'd all come in. They were all equally damaged. Why were they suddenly? Well, because of, I suppose it's the whole ethos and the ideology of the women's movement, which is that it's all men.
Yes.
And any sane person can believe that you can have, like we did, 3 children with 2 toxic, violence-prone parents, and only the boys would be affected. It's absolute rubbish. It doesn't make any sense at all.
I think as well, because am I right in thinking at Chiswick you had men working there?
Oh yes, from the beginning. First, the mothers and I, when we used to have our meetings, we first got a little bit of money from the public, actually, from the publicity. And the first thing the mothers all said, and I agreed, that we should have a man coming in to work with the children. Yeah. And then more and more male volunteers came in. They were all fantastic.
Yeah.
And Peter Tatchell used to take the children out.
Oh wow!
Yes, he was lovely.
Oh.
And it for us, not just for the children, but many of the women had no real appreciation of how a man could be gentle and still be a man.
Yeah.
And Mike Dunn, who was my right hand, and Anne Ashby was my left hand, the two of them were fantastic. Mike was a huge, great rugby player, Irish. He'd been a priest for about 3 weeks, and then discovered another calling. And the mothers used to say, "Well, Mike's not a man," and I'd say, "What do you mean he's not a man?" "Well, he never hits anybody." I know, but you understand that, you see, because that's what they knew.
Yes, but it seems to me that it would be really important to give everyone who's coming into this situation positive male kind of references, so they do understand that.
Always follow the money. When it comes to domestic violence movement, it's $1 billion industry, and it's you think about it, it's actually it's earmarked a women-only area. So the history of it, which is in This Way to the Revolution, it was started in America, and the idea at that time was left-wing groups, men and women, working to destroy capitalism. Well, after a period of time, a group of women in Washington said, no, what we need our own movement. So we will move the goalposts. It's no longer capitalism. We're going to call it patriarchy. It's men who are the enemy. They have oppressed us for centuries. Brilliant move. I mean, as a strategy for raising money, it's second to none. You think of all the gender studies in universities across the Western world. Only women could teach, therefore only women professors will get tenure for that. So, and it goes into everything, and particularly into the refuge movement. William Collins. William?
Yes.
You were the one that had a look at the financials for refuge, didn't you?
That's right, yes. It's a few years ago now, but yeah, it came out as about, in the UK, about 300 million a year is what we're getting, mostly from public funds and mostly via local authorities, but with quite a lot of private charities giving as well, particularly things like Comic Relief and Big Lottery.
But the problem with that money is that it doesn't actually get to refugees, does it? Because the refugees, you see, they have in their housing benefit, it's augmented to allow for staffing. Yeah. So refugees are pretty much, not all of them, but most of them are and don't need much. All that extra money goes into the gender feminist movement. That's what actually keeps it going across, not just with us, across the Western world. And it's billions that are going in.
Yeah, Deborah Powney was telling me about the funding for Women's Aid, and she explained to me that they're essentially triple funded. That's their model. So they're getting, they're covered by the local councils, then they're covered also by central government, and then they're covered by donations, and she was talking about how on the donation page, you can go and buy, a kit for a woman, for a victim in there, which includes kind of all of her toiletries and stuff like that. But if you go right down to the bottom of the page and read the tiny, tiny small print, it says, well, we might spend it on that, but in all likelihood, we'll just do whatever we want with it, and she told me about an incident that she'd heard about from someone who'd been in there getting services from them, where a local business gave them a big donation so that they could have a barbecue. And there was a big, check giving ceremony, and with all the women kind of having their photograph taken. And then when the barbecue came to be, the residents were asked to bring their own food. And they said, well, what happened to the donation? And they said, oh no, you don't worry about that. That's nothing.
Well, it's my opinion, and only my opinion, that it has been a fraudulent movement from the beginning. And I say that because of what was behind it. And what was behind it is the desperation of it's called the Women's Liberation Movement in those days. Mm-hmm. Worked in the office in London, off Shaftesbury Avenue. They had an office. And I saw then the donations of £3.10 from women all over the country. And they used to rip open the letters, take the cash out, and then just throw the letters into this big cupboard. And I took out the letters and tried to answer them, because there were women who were in all sorts of different situations asking for help. So I wasn't under any illusion about what would be happening. And to this day, next year is the 50th anniversary of the opening of my refuge. And I don't look forward to it with much happiness, because it's a vision that's failed.
Can I just interject at that point? Because I was going to ask you, can you associate a date with the opening? Because we're going to need that, aren't we?
Yeah.
I think that it opened in I think November. And it's going to be really hard. I mean, even trying to get any of the TV stations interested, because in a sense, you have to remember that the narrative has been in the hands of Refuge, particularly because Sandra Hawley has very, very glittery, glossy people around her, including Cherry Blair, which is no surprise to me.
But they will almost certainly be making hay with the 50th anniversary themselves. So there needs to be a counter narrative. However hard we find it to get mainstream media attention, that we need to mount some sort of counter narrative that's telling the truth.
But no, there won't, because they don't consider 1971. If you look at the websites of both Women's Aid and Refuge, you'll see that I'm airbrushed out.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
The date they put in is 1974.
Oh well, in that case, next year we have a clear run at the publicity. That's good. Erin, can I just ask on that note, the note of they didn't really ever have the interests of women at heart. If you look at thinking about women victims of domestic abuse specifically, if you look at the totality of the effect that the feminist movement has had, and Women's Aid and Refuge in particular, do you think on balance they've had a net positive effect or a net disbenefit?
It's been immensely positive for women who just needed refuge and a helping hand. And there are good refuges. And one of the ones I'm very close to is in North Devon, and it's run by Sue Wallace. It's a very, very good refuge, and there are good refuges. But having said that, because they refuse to accept the most of the refugees, and certainly the feminist ideology. In fact, when I heard that Sandra Hawley had taken over the refuge, I wrote her a letter. I was in America by that time. Said, anything I can do to help you? And she wrote back and said, well, there's nothing, because women don't need therapeutic intervention. Women are victims of male oppression. And she closed down all the projects. One of the projects that was very close to my heart was the boys' project. They had their own house. So the older boys, I used to apprentice them, each one, to different men who had skills, whether they were plasterers or plumbers or electricians or whatever. And those mentored they mentored my boys, and the boys worked and they were paid. They couldn't get a welfare, and they had their own house and they made their own rules, and it was such a good project. And one of the things I have to tell you, because it's so indicative of how we don't understand people who are violent, that those great big boys, many of whom had histories with the police, I had a room that was dark brown, big dark brown comfortable carpet with big bean bags, and I had a whole row of Tonka toys and forts and soldiers, and you'd have these huge lads all lying on their tummies on the floor playing. But you can't play if you're in a violent family. Isolated. So part of you is crippled, stuck at that 3-year-old rage of a child that has been abandoned, betrayed, and traumatized by sex and violence. And if we would only listen, if we would only run the refuges as therapeutic communities, mothers, so they can mother themselves and their children, we could empty mental hospitals and prisons. But nobody would listen.
Look, Erin, if we look back on our lifetime, we've seen the dissolution of the extended family. We've seen the dissolution of tight-knit local neighborhood communities. We've seen the deliberate destruction of the nuclear family. What part do you think those things have played in what we now see as the prevalence of domestic abuse?
Well, I think you have to remember from the very beginning, in those great big collectives where I used to go and stand on the platform and try and argue with them, they all said marriage is a dangerous place for men and for women and children. The new model is going to be women and children without men. And in 1990, Harriet Harman wrote a paper. It was a policy paper for the Labour Party. And in it, she said, men are not necessarily harmonious to married life. And that is she has been our women's minister. And I think that's shocking and very frightening. Nobody would listen.
Well, it goes right against all of the evidence. You know, we know that the safest place for most women and children is within a stable marriage, you know, and that biological fathers are just so great in so many ways for children.
You can say all that, but you have to look at who ran the narrative. Because as the women's movement became more powerful, they all began this business of employing each other. So now you've got the majority of lawyers and solicitors are women, doctors, women. In the media, virtually, because it's considered a women's subject, you only get women writing about it. They're virtually all feminists. So, you know, nobody hears about the other side. You can't get it printed.
No.
That's why we can sit here and sing off the same hymn sheet, but how do we get out to other people? That's why I desperately need the conference where this evidence-based research, not just from Deborah Powney and Nicola Cavan Graham, if I got the wrong way around.
Graham Cavan,
and also Liz Bates. I mean, there's so many brilliant women out there who have got the evidence. We need to be able to get together so the public can hear it.
Yes, I think we have to work on the public, because the political level is a lost cause. I mean, if you read what's been coming out of the Family Justice Review, for example, or the Law Commission's report on hate crime, I mean, they read like feminist primers. That's just disgusting. It's got worse, if anything, not better. So we have to undermine or influence the political process through public opinion, I think, because there's no other way.
The public does seem to be receptive to the truth, though. I think people instinctively realise, you know, if you look at the Centre for Social Justice survey they did quite a few years ago now, they found that the vast majority of British people were in favour of ring fencing support and funds to help families, and that they regarded fatherlessness as a major problem. So, you know, I do think that the public are very, you know, quite aware and very much receptive to these ideas.
Yes,
but you know,
how do we jump?
Not we can have any impact.
How do we jump over the media and the television stations to get to the audience?
Well, the internet has been doing a good job so far, but of course the internet is increasingly subject to censorship. So whether that will continue.
Yes, and if Laura Bates has her way, then anti-feminism will be categorized as domestic terrorism. So we'll be in big trouble then.
A mass of lies. Her story about the White Ribbon situation, which I was involved with, is completely off the wall. It isn't at all what happened. So I mean, it's a book that's open to produce a book like that is so careless. My only hope is that very few people bother to read it. I wouldn't. I haven't.
No, I haven't either. Erin, can I move the story on? After you left the UK in 81, 82, you then went, I think you went to the USA to begin with, and subsequently lived in many countries, including Italy, for a long time.
I was married to an American at that point. So I went and took my whole family to Santa Fe, New Mexico, where I thought two things. One is, I never want to have to be desperate for funds, so for a refuge. So I was naive that I was. I thought, well, I'll have to write a bestseller. I'd never written fiction, and my non-fiction was out of print immediately, because from the very beginning I had terrible trouble. Scream Quietly or the Neighbors Will Hear is the first book in the world on domestic violence out of print.
And I note that came out in the magic year of 1972 when Women's Aid was formed.
That's right.
And the narrative you were presenting in that book was very different from the feminist one then, and still is now.
Well, the thing there was that the man who was in the managing director of a Penguin Special was an international Marxist. So when he saw me, he began to talk about, of course, capitalism, and it doesn't happen in Russia. I looked at him and said, how can you say that? There's no women in the Politburo for a start. Yes, they can drive tractors. In a Maoist China, they were actually aborting women who wanted more than one child. So, but that did me in with him. So I had a hell of a job getting it published, but it was almost immediately scrubbed. And then the other book was Prone to Violence. And that was the work with violent mothers. That's it. Yes, it's hard to get that. And what I did was, I had a police escort all around England for the publication of that book, and that doesn't happen unless you've been seriously.
No, that's right. So while you were in America, you were continuing to assist people in some way, weren't you, including men? What was the mechanism for that? Well, did you have a refuge there, or what?
A second, we moved into a small house. Then, with the publication of The Watershed, became a huge bestseller. Thank God, because that's what I wanted to happen. Then it was my money. I could do what I liked. And then I had this small house And for a lot of the time, we used that as another refuge. Now, it was funny because it was in America where I mostly came across men who were innocent victims of part. I was shocked by the aggression of American women, and I still am to this day.
Yeah,
it's interesting because when Freud was alive, the only one trip he made to America, he was as horrified as I was, and he wrote a letter. And in the letter, he said, if American men don't deal with American women, nothing good will happen, virtually, is what he was saying. He's right. Mm-hmm. And so what we have is men would know what the work I did. Everybody did, because I was in a big community. And they'd come to me and I'd take on their histories. I'd take on their cases and I'd fight for them in courts. I was well known in the Santa Fe courts. Right. That and pedophilia, that was the other thing because Santa Fe was, at that point, 1982, it was pretty lawless. There were only two district attorneys, and most of the pedophile cases just didn't get anywhere until I came along. And again, I made it my business to find out where it was happening and then deal with the victims of it.
This was all male paedophiles, was it? Or
no. There's many female paedophiles, but they can cover themselves up. For instance, the women paedophiles will use suppositories or their fingers, and it's much more insidious because it's difficult to pin down. But oh yes, I mean there is no such thing as women and men can be equally evil as each other, and until we accept that, one of the problems at this moment, and it's largely men like their women on pedestals, particularly their mothers.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
They've got to learn to get over that.
Yeah. It's gynocentrism is what we call it. Yeah, that's what it is. That you've mentioned the novels. You wrote 10, I think, altogether.
Yeah, 10 or 11.
Yeah. So the first one was a runaway success, was it? I never knew. Yeah, so you made a lot of money. I must say it's an unusual strategy to write fiction for money. It doesn't work for many people, but clearly did work for you.
Well, it's actually, the thing is that my novels are deeply psychological, and because all my non-fiction was out of print, I put an awful lot of what I felt about the women's movement into my novels.
Right, I was going to ask you that. Was the novel writing really a way of getting your version of the narrative back?
Both, because if you ever come across a serious narcissistic exhibitionist in a relationship, then you don't realize until it's far too late how very dangerous that relationship is. And that's what The Watershed's about. The woman starts the book, she's sitting in a mental hospital where he's put her, and he comes and visits her every night, and everybody thinks he's wonderful. So my books are largely very deeply psychological, and it's important, and some of them are more important than others. But it took a bit of time, because in the 80s, one of your problems was the majority of editors, women editors, were gender feminists, of course. And I was bounced from one gender feminist to another. And then the final one said, I hate you, I hate your books, I don't want to publish them. Fair enough.
Wow.
Well, because, as a radical, she was a radical lesbian. And my books are all about men and women loving, fighting, hating each other, but ultimately the need that we have for each other and for our children.
So did you stop writing novels because you couldn't get published any longer, or did you stop writing them because sales had dropped off?
She organised it. She was HarperCollins editor to remain to all my backlist of novels, which is so nobody can get my books. You can only get them.
You can get them second hand.
Yeah, second hand. But it'd be quite nice if they were still in the shops, wouldn't it?
Yes, yeah, that's true. Yeah, I got one the other day. This one. Remember that one?
Oh, The Wicked World of Women. Yes, I do. Yeah.
I've not read it yet.
Fun to write. Yeah, I actually did the trip. It's all about 3 women who can hire a yacht and sail from Elba right the way down. It's a great book, actually. I enjoyed it.
Oh, good. I'm glad I've got that one. Were you staying in the Cayman Islands at the time when you wrote that book?
So what I hadn't realised is that the community we lived in, because I had grandchildren, and they were little and they needed to go to school. So we lived in a sort of a community, a gated community called El Dorado. And we were the only black family. And a lot of boys grew up in my house. And so they'd come out to visit. So there'd be strapping great lads doing all their kung fu on the front lawn. I used to ask them not to. So there was terrible panic among a lot of them from Louisiana and Baton Rouge families. And, I remember just saying to the woman, one of the women, why don't you just put your white Ku Klux Klan hoods on and your uniform and come and burn a cross on my lawn? It'd be so much simpler for all of us. Yeah, it was that bad. So eventually I went down to see Billy, who was my travel agent. So where can I go in the world that my grandchildren can have a chance of growing up without racism? He said, the Cayman Islands. It's 60% mixed race. So we packed up everything, 8 dogs, 3 cats. The family, it was getting bigger and bigger, ended on this tiny 12-mile island called the Brack. And I lived in a pyramid, a 50-foot pyramid on the beach with everybody. And then my daughter got married and they moved out. It was a lovely, lovely, lovely time, but even lovelier when it was time to leave after 4 or 5 years. I'd sort of written Swimming with Dolphins there. And I'd always wanted to live in Tuscany.
Yeah.
So my children were all settled. So I moved to a forest in Tuscany. And I lived there by myself with the 4 dogs and cats, and would have still been there, except that I knew I had to come back because my work wasn't done. And I did come back. And I've been making a nuisance of myself ever since.
Does it frustrate you, just going back to domestic violence, does it frustrate you that nearly 50 years ago, the familial origins of domestic violence were so well known to you, and yet even now it's still denied? And does it frustrate you that you see the way that genuine domestic violence victims are treated is so essentially counterproductive?
It doesn't frustrate me because I think I knew from the very beginning. It was very simple. At one point, when the persecuting was at its worst, and and I've been to Acton's court, and we managed to win that argument, and then we were up in the High Court, and then from the High Court up to the House of Lords. And I knew from the very beginning if I was going to take this on, this is really the trajectory that I had chosen, because that awful Woman King, who was a violent man anyway, he was the head of Hounslow Council. He had called me in and he sat there and he said, Mrs. Pizzey, you can have everything you like. All you have to do is to keep to the 36 mothers and children. And I just said, I can't. And that's the choice you make, isn't it? And now, I live in one room. It's a lovely room. I'm very happy with it, but I have absolutely nothing. I have a 15-year-old car that I love. And you know what? It's actually quite comforting because no one can do anything to me because I have nothing to take.
Yeah. Are you a religious person, Erin?
Yes. Well, put it this way. I'm a lover of God in all his aspects, but not man-made religions. A believer, absolutely, that potentially we are all divine. And I actually said that to a very frightening man on the doorstep who was threatening me. And I just looked at him and I said, do you realize that you are potentially divine? And they stopped for a moment and his eyes filled with tears. And he walked off.
Is there anything, looking back, that you would have done differently? I know you said just then that you had the option of unlimited funds and being able to run your refuges as long as you ran them according to how the radical feminists wanted you to, and you made your choice. But is there anything looking back that you would have done differently? Perhaps not that meeting in the church hall.
But I think in a way, whether there was a meeting in the church hall or not, it would have happened anyway. Because once I knew, when I got kicked out of the women's movement, and I have a letter banning me from all collectives, which is quite strange for a liberation movement. Anyway, I knew that the moment, and I didn't even think about it because the beginning was a tiny little house with just, the mothers pouring in. I didn't think until we started getting donations. And I suddenly thought, this is going to end badly, because the feminist movement, and I knew how strapped for cash they were. And I knew that they needed a cause that they could actually organize around. And so there isn't anything different I could have done, I think.
No.
Yeah, I suppose if you caught up with the flow of history, there's only a limited amount you can do.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it's, you have to go to bed and live with yourself, and at some point, you might meet your maker and have your goods and your sins measured against each other. And so there's only one choice a lot of the time. In my belief, you will not be measured, not be judged.
No, you are loved more than any human love can ever even imagine. And that's where you go back to. You do your trials on the earth.
Right.
But my great feeling about all this is, it's harder now for me than it was when I was fighting openly and I had a refuge and I had a voice. It's harder now for all of us, you and for William, because we're in this and we're stifled. I mean, there is a very good documentary maker who's trying to make a documentary of the work that I'm doing, and going and helping me go through the archives to actually look at the history of it all. And it's all there under my bed. But the thing is that she can't get any television station to take it, which is no surprise to me.
I know. I mean, I wish it didn't still surprise me, but it amazes me, because we're talking about a really good and important story. And the fact that all of these sectors, like, including the media, are just so infiltrated with these radical feminists.
The other part that's such the worry, you see, what tends to happen, an awful lot of women solicitors will actually say to a woman who wants a divorce, claim domestic violence.
Yeah.
Because it'll fast track. Yeah. Now, if that isn't fast enough, you then claim that he's molested your children's children. And that will do it. He will be out. He will never see his kids again. In Canada, they call it the first, you go to the lawyer and you claim domestic violence. It's called hoovering. He goes back home, his wife and kids are gone. All he'll be told by the police is they're in a safe place. He won't have any idea where they are. Because men are, from the moment, the most dangerous part of any relationship a man can have with a woman is that he must know that if she's living together, she can pick up the phone with no evidence needed and say, he's domestic violence. He's and even now the onus of the new lawyers coming in, which are saying the controlling. If you know the controlling and the, what is the other part of that?
Coercive control.
Yeah, coercive control. Who's to say what coercive control is?
Oh, well, the feminists are to say, that's the point.
How can you make a law over something that is a human issue?
Yeah.
And at the times I deal with men who've been falsely accused, you probably all remember the case, I hope you do, of the young man going home on Waterloo Station.
Mark Pearson.
That's Mark Pearson. He used to come here regularly when he had been accused. I mean, it was so flagrant. If you looked at the CTV cameras, you could see he didn't touch her. And yet he was dragged through the courts. Yes, he's finally found. He's not found. No man is found not guilty. They're found not guilty for lack of evidence.
Yeah, if you interview Liam Allen, who went through that rape trial, that famous rape trial that collapsed, because the accuser had actually sent a text saying it wasn't non-consensual or anything, which pretty much clinched it. Even today, he says he's not back to normal, and he can't envisage ever being, because that sort of thing leaves an indelible mark on your psyche, I think.
But what it does, the betrayal of everything you think is there, put there for you, and it's not. It's corrupt. Family courts are one of the most corrupt courts in Western England, in the Western world, as far as I'm concerned. And I've had battles in that family court for years.
Well, it's because it's an adversarial system and one side has all the power. And every time they change the law, it just gets more and more unbalanced.
Well, because
so now the acute, I mean, first of all, they took legal aid away.
Yeah.
And then so they've forced men who didn't have the money to pay vast sums to solicitors and barristers to defend themselves as litigants in person. And then they pass a law saying, oh, no, you can't defend yourself at all. Stop you cross-examining your victim, your alleged victim. And it just goes on. And the alleged victim can now give evidence by video. She doesn't need the trauma of having to appear in court. Well, who's going to be more traumatized? Somebody that's telling the truth or somebody that's actually lying? I mean, and it just goes on and on and on with the power being piled more and more in one direction.
See, the problem with this is too, the court doesn't allow for personality disorders. So the majority of people who are fighting against their partners, particularly with parental alienation, the court is their theatre, because they're more than willing to lie under oath. They love that moment in the court where they can spout, and especially because they know it's one-sided anyway. So, and on the whole, the majority of violence-prone people coming from violence-prone families, you'll find have personality disorders. One of the things that happen when to children, if they are twisted and they grow up damaged and traumatized, and this is why eventually it all has to come out of courts. It has to be handled quite differently, because, as you say, the adversarial system makes a bad situation worse.
Yeah.
And your problem is the judges, on the whole, listen to social workers, and the vast majority of social workers are women, and they're gender feminists.
Yeah.
So you've got this cycle. So the lawyers, the vast majority are feminists, and the difficulty is explaining to women, say, of course I'm a feminist. No, you're not. What you are is an equity feminist. You believe in equality for men and women, as do many men. But what the majority of women who call themselves feminists don't realize is the agenda behind it. You see, and until they get educated, we're stifled. How do you, this book, Its Way to the Revolution, it had not one single review anywhere.
I know. And you were turned down by any number of publishers as well, despite the fact you would think the story of the first refuge by the woman who opened it would be, they'd be fighting each other to get it, but no.
Well, that just tells you, doesn't it?
It does. And, we've been talking about feminism, and certainly in the 80s, the problem was the gender feminism. But I think by the mid-90s, and the problem we really face now is that feminism had allied itself with national and international politics, which is why we now have things coming out of the Ministry of Justice and the United Nations and the EU and all over the place that are all totally 100% feminist. So we're now fighting the establishment is feminist. That's the problem. It's this twin pillars of attack that we're facing, and the only people that can face that down are the people.
But they're not just the people. The one thing that's interesting is how did we have such a very, very vociferous, effective women's movement, and where's the men's movement?
Well, you're fighting psychology on that one. I mean, men don't have in-group preference, and women do. It comes down simply to that, and you're not going to overcome that. But that is what we in the men's movement have always been struggling with.
I know. I've taught movements all over the world, actually. It was the last one. And I just basically saying, if I asked you to build a bridge, you'd do it. But if I asked you to take care of each other, you don't know how to do it.
Yeah. That's why women's role is not just important but essential, because Men will never be able to do it on their own. It's, well, as you rightly said in the past, Erin, it's historically unique that women en masse have turned on men en masse.
I know.
The only way, what that actually proves is the very opposite of what the feminists claim, and namely that women are powerless and men have all the power. It proves that that can't possibly be right. How could that be right if feminism has gone from nothing to world domination in our lifetimes without ever winning a ballot or fighting a war, unless they already had a lot of natural power, which of course women do have, because they have immense social and moral power. And that's, and until women accept that they're morally and socially extremely powerful, they won't accept their own role in what's happened. And it's going to take even more crushing, I'm afraid, of men before the majority of women wake up. But what will happen in the interim is more and more men will be just saying, I'm out of here, I'm out.
Or they'll kill themselves.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, that's the ultimate I'm out, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's all feeling very bleak at the moment. I wonder, Erin, is there anything that fills you with hope for the future?
Yes, it does. There's a whole raft of young people, men and women, working in universities, studying domestic violence, who will come forward, give the evidence, and the changes will come. The tragedy is the generations of children that we have damaged beyond, in many cases, any redemption in the 50 years that have gone. And that I put down to the gender feminist movement. I put that down to people like Sandra Hawley, who knows the truth, given the kinds of money that she's making and the empire that she runs from a very expensive office in the middle of the city. By the way, this is where your taxpayers' money is going. I think that there is a hope for the future. We'll look back on this time as a dark ages, and all we can say about ourselves is we tried to carry the light.
Well, I think that would be a lovely place to end. Thank you for carrying the light for so many years.
And for you, and for William.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. That is a good place to end, and keep fighting the good fight as we will in our own unique ways.
Yeah, we will. God bless you all, and all the men and the women who are supporting us.